platform in which to do so.
Okay.
And many states are starting to take it over. I was actually just on a meeting with Oregon, who said, "Oh, we got to get our stuff set up because they're ready to move on Ryan's Law here. So we need to
Yeah.
make sure." And they're actually trying to push to make sure that the only people that can write recs are people who are educated in medical cannabis. And I was like,
Imagine that.
good job, Oregon.
Yeah.
Very excited.
It's an evolution. That's where we're at in the early days. That's, I think, the thing we all need to keep in mind is that this is all just going to continue to evolve.
So we'll
Yeah,
give-
I did hear that they were, the family is taking it to all the other states. So that's very good.
I think Oklahoma also is in the process of looking into it, which is awesome. And some of the East Coast states. So I'm thrilled. I think it should go. I mean, if I was on my deathbed, I'd want to be able to do take whatever medication I needed to feel the best I can towards the end of my life.
Right, to choose, right? It's not like we must be given medical cannabis.
Yeah,
To
of
be
course.
allowed
But
to
like,
choose.
if I decided that's what I wanted, I want to feel like I had the dignity to make that, like the right to make that choice for myself, and to not feel like I was, something was wrong with me for making that decision.
Right.
We have a few more people coming in. We'll get started soon. In the meantime, if you can just make your name visible on your screen, that would be great. We'll give everyone about another minute to join, and then we'll get started.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. You can tell we're excited to talk about this. So
And I think my wife's excited for me to talk about this to someone else. So
Okay, great. I guess we will get started. Is that okay, Carrie, to get started now? Okay, great. So welcome everyone to today's webinar, Applying Ryan's Law to Compassionate Use of Cannabis in Healthcare Facilities. My name is Lisa McDonald. I'm the Associate Director of Continuing Professional Development here at USC School of Pharmacy. But before we begin today's webinar, I wanted to briefly go over a few housekeeping items. So yes. So we'd like to get to know you a little better. So if you can just please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're from, that would be awesome. Also, we're going to do a 10-minute Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. So if you have any questions, please be sure to place them in the chat. We're also going to have some breakout rooms today. So please be sure to click join when you see that pop up on your screen. And then continuing education, we're going to be sending out an email next week after the session to verify attendance. So you'll receive an email from me next week. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Leah Johnson, who's going to be going over the learning objectives and introducing our speakers for today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having us here. My name, as Lisa mentioned, is Dr. Leah Johnson. And so our objectives today is, the biggest thing is we want to, a couple of the biggest things are, we want to differentiate the types of medical cannabis used for compassionate purposes and their status according to the federal and California laws, because there's a lot of discrepancy in questions, especially when it comes to CBD products. So we will go over that today and really get a little bit more in depth, so to increase knowledge about really what cannabis is, where it comes from, and what California laws, how we regulate it. We're also going to identify the key features and requirements for Ryan's Law, what will allow a patient to meet these requirements. And lastly, also, we're going to make sure that we articulate the possible facility policies and procedures, which we'll go over in the breakout rooms. And then the policies and procedures we'll be going over, they comply with state and law and minimize the institutional risk resulting from the federal enforcement. So a way just to keep ourselves protected as healthcare professionals and keep our facilities protected as well. Okay, so our speakers. So we will be speaking with you today. We are the Pharmacist Cannabis Coalition of California, also known as PCCC. And we are a coalition of California pharmacist leaders advocating for the safe use of medical cannabis. We formed the group specifically because we knew that there was there's not as much regulation when it comes to medical cannabis in the state of California. So we really wanted to promote better education about medical cannabis for patients and practitioners around the state of California. So our speakers today, first we've got Dr. Jill Simonian. Dr. Jill Simonian is an affiliate faculty member from UCSD Skaggs School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. We also have Dr. Carrie Franson, who is a professor of clinical pharmacy at the University of Southern California. We also have Dr. Paul Laughlin, who is the owner of Golden Gate Pharmacy Holdings and also a pharmacist consultant for them. And we also have Dr. Cody Peterson, who is a clinical pharmacist and at the Children's Hospital of Orange County, and is also a scientific advisor for the Kenigma. And myself, I'm Dr. Leah Johnson. I'm medical cannabis long-term care consultant pharmacist for Alchemist Consulting. And we also do have Dr. Robert Stein, who is our other executive member of the PCCC. So for disclosures, myself, Dr. Simonian, Laughlin, Stein, and Peterson, none of us have any conflicts to disclose. Dr. Franson has received financial compensation from Teva Pharmaceuticals for consulting on pharmacology unrelated to products discussed in the CE. So that's all for the disclosures, and this presentation will include discussion of off-label, experimental, and or investigational use of the drug. Again, we always say that it's not FDA approved yet, the general use of THC and CBD, unless it's in the products that we will be discussing later. Tetrahydrocannabinol is THC, CBD is cannabidiol, and other cannabinoids such as which will be referred to as CB, and the products are from products derived from cannabis. So this is what we're going to go over. So we're going to start with a couple questions just to get an idea of how much our audience knows about the use of medical cannabis. Do you guys want me to read off the questions? No. Okay.
But we should be playing some Jeopardy music.
Yeah.
Just so you know, we can see your efforts in responding once you get to the end. So make sure you hit submit when you get to the end. Then we'll know you guys have completed your work.
And don't worry, we're going to go through all of these topics on this webinar. So anything that maybe you didn't know so much about, you'll learn on this webinar. So it's a really great starting place.
We have our first contestant completing the test. Yay! Woo! Coming in fast and furious now. Way to go, group. Let's see if we can get a few more to submit. Fantastic. We're up to, over 70% of you all participating. Give you just a few more seconds. All right, it's been 3.5 minutes. We're going to call it. Go ahead and click submit even if you haven't. All right. So you all can see, you all can see these, right? Is that correct?
Yes, they can.
Okay, so you can scroll through here and see how everybody performed. So there's a lot of variability in some of these answers. So that means we've got a lot to share today. So that's fantastic. And we're, like Leah said, we are going to cover all of this. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Cody to go ahead and launch us into the meat of this.
Absolutely. And I think that this is going to really drive home the last question. It seemed like a lot of people knew that we can't use vapes under Ryan law, but there wasn't a whole lot of agreement on sort of the THC and Schedule 1 question. And so I think that sort of drives home a point that there's a lot of unknowns or sort of lack of education around cannabis in general due to the stigma and the illegality over the last 50 years, 100 years, depending on which time frame you look at. We can really see a lack of understanding. So most Americans think that marijuana, THC and CBD are the same chemical. Now, first of all, even the headline from Newsweek is confusing because marijuana is a designation for a cannabis plant, which we'll get into on the next slide. THC and CBD are molecules produced within the cannabis plant. So there's really not a lot of understanding or even consistency around how these words are used or understood to be. So let's get a baseline understanding of what we're talking about. Now, the types of cannabis products available to patients or just generally available around the world consists of these 4 general categories. You could sort of nitpick and try to break them down even further, but we put them in these 4 large categories for you to understand. Dried herbal cannabis. This is cannabis it's a flower that has been dried and then is usually then used to maybe smoke or to vaporize or to extract. But this is the most traditional form of cannabis. It's sort of the natural form. Cannabis is an annual flower. It grows. At the end of the year, it dies. It dries naturally in nature, or you can cut it down, harvest it like a crop, okay? These cannabis flowers contain many molecules, but the ones that we've really found interest are the cannabinoids, that's THC, CBD, and many more, as well as the terpenes, which are essential oils of plants, which it turns out that cannabis is quite a prolific producer of, producing nearly 2, even 3% of its weight in plant essential oils. Now, another thing that we can do, and many patients are consuming, is extract the cannabinoids and the terpenes from the plant material, and then we can get a product resulting from that. And these products range on a spectrum from a very natural product consisting of all the sort of plant resins that have been extracted, all the way down to a highly processed cannabinoid isolate. So something that is purely 99.9% CBD. Now, this is obviously a very large task to take a plant and break it all the way down into this isolate. So there is something to be said about the cost of producing these molecules from plants and the level of machinery that's needed to create an isolate. And there's also this term, full spectrum. You'll find it's kind of a marketing term, but the idea is that you're trying to extract all of the active molecules from the plant. But again, a bit of a marketing term, and definitely another term without a formal definition, but general consensus in the industry is a broad spectrum extract. and that extract is THC free, right? Allowing you to consume it without the worry of maybe a positive drug test, but does still contain other cannabinoids or other terpenes from the plant that are thought to contribute to overall pharmacoactivity. So the last or another category that we've delineated here for you is plant-derived pharmaceuticals, meaning products that are not just available on the open market or from a dispensary, but rather from the pharmacy approved by the FDA, perhaps. And you can see that this exists when it comes to CBD. There is a commercially available CBD Epidiolex available on the market today. And then we also have, that's in the United States. And there's also a hybrid product, a THC CBD balance product mixed approximately 1-to-1, called nabiximols, that's available in 21 countries around the world, but not the US. It's primarily used for multiple sclerosis. And it is 2 plant extracts mixed together. So essentially 2 of the extracts from category number 2, full spectrum extracts, one rich in THC, one rich in CBD, mixed together, and they've approved that as that standard mix across the world. Lastly, there are cannabinoids that have nothing to do with plants at all, that either made in a laboratory, like dronabinol. This is delta-9 THC, the exact molecule that the plant makes, but made entirely in a laboratory. And then we have synthetic cannabinoids like nabilone. And nabilone is it looks chemically like THC with some chemical manipulations that have never occurred in nature, some methylations, in order to make a much more potent variety, often dosed at least 1/5 of the dose of THC due to its potent psychoactivity. So where is your cannabis coming from? It's coming from a farm, right? And a farmer has to grow this because this is inherently a plant. There are some new technologies that are coming out and that might challenge this, but for the last 12,000 years, humans have been growing cannabis plants. And these cannabis plants could either be producing THC or be producing CBD because they're the same plant with just genetics turned on even. And so these same plants that are growing have been legally defined into 2 separate categories. You can see the one on the left is hemp. That is a THC with less than a cannabis plant with a dry content of less than 0.3% THC. So it's not a whole lot of THC, but there are certainly cannabis plants out there that are making that, and the government has defined that as hemp. On the right-hand side, you can see that a cannabis plant containing more THC than 0.3% is considered marijuana. Now, marijuana is a C1, a Schedule I substance, according to the DEA. However, that is not the status in California. Marijuana you can grow, it just must be grown with a license from the state of California, or by any patient, or well, actually, since 2018, any adult in California can grow marijuana in their own home, 6 of them actually. So there is not a lot of difference between these 2 plants. And you can see if you look to the middle chemically, there's not a lot of difference between these 2 molecules either. So the only difference between the marijuana plant and the hemp plant is the actual enzyme that's turned on to convert a shared base molecule, CBGA, cannabigerolic acid, okay? This is then bioconverted by the marijuana plant to THCA or by the hemp plant to CBDA. It's the same precursor molecule, and it depends on which genetics the plant has that produces the next molecule. Then, of course, during smoking, for example, THCA is converted into the psychoactive high-inducing molecule THC. And then, yes, the plant makes CBDA, and we often decarboxylate it into CBD to have an effect. I think one interesting thing to the pharmacists in the room to note is there is well thought to be pharmacologic activity of the cannabinoid acids above there, but for whatever reason, historically, we've been a little skewed to the decarboxylated molecule scientifically. Now, things sort of got shaken up in 2018 when the USDA Farm Bill, which is regularly updated, I believe every 4 years, was updated, and it removed hemp, that's all the cannabis growing on the left side of your screen, removed hemp from the controlled substance list and allowed it as a sale as an agricultural commodity, allowing states to regulate it and apply for grants to grow it, to learn how to best grow it and maybe use it as feed or to support farmers in general. And then of course, to give them another plant to harvest and sort of make a living, which becomes harder and harder for farmers every year. And we know this plant is a prolific grower and has a lot of unique characteristics that could potentially help the country and help the planet, kind of green tech. Anyway, next slide, we can move on. So these cannabis plants come in a lot of different varieties, right? And we've heard the word strain potentially. We try to move away from that vernacular because that has little to do with typical plant genetics and plant botany, and it has more to do with sort of cultural dialogue about breeding. What we really want to get down to is what is the chemotype of the cannabis that we're talking about. And you can break these chemotypes down in a number of different ways, and there's some different terminology that can be used. But you can see that the THC type, or a type 1 cannabis chemotype, is very rich in THC, ranging from sort of a modest 4% up to even a 35% of the dry weight of the cannabis plant can be THC. Now, that is a modern modern variety grown with modern technology, fed modern nutrition, but that is a very high percent for any plant to make anything. And so it's quite robust. Now you have something in between. It's called a hybrid type 2 balanced variety. And you can see that it produces CBD and THC simultaneously side by side. Now this is because it shares both enzymes, the CBDA synthase and THCA synthase. And this is just a state of the plant. Plants can naturally have this genetic makeup. And then of course we have the CBD type. This is hemp or type 3 cannabis, and it can be pretty meager in its cannabinoid production, or it can grow very cannabinoid rich flowers and be almost indistinguishable from marijuana, but with those crystals growing on the plant being not THC, but just CBD. So those are the cannabis chemotypes. And I think it's really important for pharmacists to understand that these chemotypes that do occur naturally in nature also tend to drive pharmacologic effects. And you'll get very different psychoactivity and even different reported sort of variations with each different type of cannabis when you're trying to treat different ailments. Now, I think I really want to drive home that there's all these different cannabis types, and then there's all these different ways to deliver cannabinoids. So just the variability in these two factors alone create a level of, complexity understanding that often the pharmacist is one of the best people to help navigate. This is our world, right? Drug delivery, variations in drug formulation, et cetera. So first and foremost, the drug delivery method that you're most familiar with is inhalation. And the reason we're all most familiar with this, right? Smoking cannabis or smoking marijuana is the best known way to deliver it. But it's certainly not the only way. But smoking is unique in that it creates a very high temperature. It's the only way of delivering cannabinoids on the list that uses temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. And certainly we think that there's plenty of bad with that, producing harmful, damaging, called aromatic hydrocarbons in the smoking process. But it does also change some of the molecules within the plant medicine, and it creates a level of pharmacologic complexity that is really kind of difficult to explain. So I think that that's an important thing for us to keep in mind, as some patients do report smoking as the only method that helps them. But we'll move past that and get on to dry plant material vaporizers, otherwise known as dry herb vapes. This is actually the method of administration preferred by the Israeli government. When you're a medical cannabis patient in Israel with cancer, they issue you a government-issued dry herb vaporizer for you to put your botanical cannabis flower in and vaporize. And this is actually quite effective because think of it more as a convection oven, bringing the plant material only up to around 400 degrees Fahrenheit and not combusting it with oxygen. So not producing nearly as many of those damaging smoke particles that come with smoking. Lastly, though, another vape that many people are familiar with is a an oil vaporizer pen. And these oil vape pens are little glass cartridges that often have a cannabis extract inside of them, and then they're attached to a small electric battery to apply heat and to vaporize these oils. Of course, there was a lot of hope for these small vapes as a very healthy alternative. But as we learn more, there's increasing concerns around the quality of the extracts, of the pens, of the containers they're in. So we really need to be mindful and open-minded to what the science suggests to us as we move forward with these oil vape pens. And we did skip. There's a couple other administration forms for the experts out there, but we'll leave it there. Oral administration. We'll get there too, Carrie. Well, we can get there too. Yeah, go ahead and click forward. So the thing is, we just talked about all that inhalation, and the truth is you're not going to talk much more about that here today, because inhalation has been exclusively prohibited under Ryan's law. It was not included, for obvious reasons in a public space, out of respect and the rights of other patients around. That has been excluded from all healthcare facility use. So for Ryan's law purposes, orals, topicals, and suppositories, what we're about to talk about, are the only options. Now, there is oral products. They can come in edibles or capsules. Obviously, we're all familiar with how capsules can come. They're often gelatin capsules, actually, but sometimes they can be made into tablets as well. We have edibles, as you know, that might be a gummy or a brownie. Obviously, these products need to be kept away from children. That's probably the biggest concern with these items, because kids like tasty things. And then orals for oils, we have cannabis tinctures, but oftentimes these are cannabis oils. And oftentimes we administer these sublingually. There's a lot of disagreement on how fast sublingual administration is, but there is some degree of belief that it is somewhat faster than taking it orally, but to what extent the current existing evidence does not suggest very significant effects at all. But to be determined. Lastly, I think topical is a completely underutilized route of administration because it is quite effective for so many people for so many different ailments. It's a great way to get patients who are cannabis averse or cannabis naive to kind of jump on the gravy train and see that there can be some benefit. And then pharmacists, especially going forward, I'm sure will be using cannabis suppositories as part of their toolbox, as this is such a useful drug delivery system. But at this time, we don't have a lot of understanding over whether these suppositories are good for systemic issues or local issues, and which issues exactly. So we really need to know a lot more. But these are the ways your patients are going to be consuming cannabis and cannabinoids. And I wanted you to have a primer on all of this before you learn about how the hospitals have to apply this law. So thank you much. I can't wait to pass it over to Carrie and get her take on the DEA's position on cannabis.
Yeah, well, thank you, Cody. And actually what you have done, I really like how you differentiated the THC from the CBD and making clear what marijuana is versus cannabis and so on. It's really important, particularly as we look at the laws and the ways in which different enforcement agencies look at these compounds. So first of all, the THC type cannabis, right? So it is Schedule I. We've heard that since 1907 in the 1970s with the Controlled Substances Act, a Schedule I product. Other drugs such as our compounds such as LSD and heroin are under this. And it's designated this because it's considered to be a substance that has a high potential for abuse, has no currently accepted medical use or treatment, and has a lack of understanding of the safety of it as well. And this has been challenged since 1970s in federal courts at least 3 times, and it's always been upheld to keep cannabis and specifically THC type cannabis as a Schedule I. What this means, according to the eyes of the enforcement agency, is that any possession, manufacture, or distribution of these products is criminalized, okay? Except for those who are given special rights. And traditionally, this has been the University of Mississippi for eons. But most recently, in the last couple of years, additional institutions have been granted the ability to grow these substances substances and these plants for research purposes. And you can see them here, Royal Emerald Pharmaceuticals, even the Biopharmaceutical Research Company. These are different things, groups that are just beginning to venture into this space. Note, however, that even though THC type cannabis is Schedule 1, we have THC itself in the form of dronabinol, is a pharmaceutical product, as Cody had mentioned. It is Schedule 3, or the capsules, as well as, but the dronabinol solution is Schedule 2, just like nabilone is. So the DEA is trying to regulate these products in such a manner. But what about what's happening with the federal view of CBD? Well, first of all, what happened was the FDA approved the pharmaceutical product Epidiolex, which is a pharmaceutical plant-derived CBD in 2018 for Dravet syndrome, and the indications for this has been expanded since then to include TCS and for patients as young as 1. And because of this, the DEA removed CBD from the Controlled Substances Act in 2020. But it remains to be under the control and review of the FDA. And so what does the FDA say? Well, the FDA looks at all the CBD that's available in the marketplace and says that, listen, we know that CBD has a pharmacologic effect on people. That's why we, approved it for the use in Dravet's and TCS. It also has demonstrated risk, and it's not generally recognized as safe. Note that part in red. And because it's not generally recognized as safe, they believe that it does not belong as an active or inactive ingredient in OTC drugs, dietary supplements, or food products. Note, however, that the FDA did not include CBD specifically as an adulterant in the Cosmetic Act. And so therefore, it is not specifically called out as something that can't be used as a cosmetic. And so that's one area where it is not regulated. In recent years, in 2021, very late, the FDA came off and said that they are going to continue to monitor and take action against anybody who is any corporation or manufacturer who is unlawfully marketing their products, specifically anybody who is trying to state that the products are being used to cure, let's say, Alzheimer's, things like that. They will go after those types of companies because they pose a risk to public health by falsely advertising something that doesn't occur. In addition, late into 2021, they also said that based on their experience with what they learned from COVID, that the FDA would be, instead of relying on the traditional pharmaceutical development path of randomized controlled trials and so forth, that it would be likely that they'll be using real world data, because so many people are gaining access to these products, that they'll be using real world data to make a decision on CBD moving forward. So that's the difference from the FDA position on THC and CBD. What's interesting, however, because we have all these products out there, you can walk into a pharmacy. When asked at the beginning of this year, where do you think, who regulates and controls CBD? People think the government does. And unfortunately, it's in one of those gray areas that the government is not actually regulating the products through the Food and Drug Control. But there is a difference between what has happened federally and what has happened at the states. And of course, California was the first when it introduced Proposition 215 in 1996 that cannabis could be used for compassionate purposes. And once this was legislated, it went through the California Health and Safety Code, section 11362.5 on specifics of allowing patients who had a medical need to be able to grow and possess their cannabis for their own use. And it went beyond just the patients who were utilizing the products, but also allowing caregivers to be able to do this as well. I like this. It always amazes me that physicians do a great job of advocating for themselves, and they made sure that in this law that if a physician was going to recommend that a patient had a condition that could possibly benefit from cannabis use, that they would be not held responsible or have any penalty for doing so. And of course, the one thing that came out of this and that everybody is concerned about is kind of like the illegal component of drug trafficking. And they wanted to make sure that this was all being done as long as it didn't go against any other laws that try to minimize the danger of drug trafficking and so on, and certainly not for medical purposes. So what has happened is California was first, but other states have followed suit. And when you look at the legalization of cannabis and particularly medical cannabis across the United States, you see that, there's well over 30 states that have done so, but there has been a variety of conditions that they consider to be appropriate for use. And I've highlighted here in red the states, California's approved conditions. And you can see that they vary. So we've approved things like HIV/AIDS, but we haven't necessarily approved PTSD specifically. But recognize that California also has this catch-all statement that a physician can recommend cannabis to help with a chronic or persistent medical symptoms of such that substantially limits your ability as the patient to conduct major life activities, or has the ability to cause serious harm to your safety, physical health, and mental health. So although that they have specific disease states, recognize that as long as the physician believes that the patient benefits or has a decreased risk by using the medical cannabis, then they are indeed able to do so. So that is a very quick rundown of kind of the lay of the land as far as laws. And now I'm going to hand it over to Paul, who is going to speak. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about CBD. Before I hand it over to Paul, forgot my slide here, and that is that not only does California have a position about THC, but they have a position about CBD. And after the passage of the Farm Bill and the DEA saying that they will no longer have CBD be part of the Controlled Substances Act, California specifically came up with an amendment to the Sherman Act. So Sherman Act is California's own law for food, drug, and cosmetics, and specifically packaging and manufacturing and stuff. And what they have said is that, hey, listen, CBD is not part of THC. And because of that, we're going to permit it to be part of food and dietary supplements and beverages, even pet food, okay? But you cannot have hemp products, CBD things, be part of medical devices, prescription drugs, things containing nicotine, tobacco, and alcoholic beverages. So that allows people to utilize and create hemp-derived products and sell them in these retail outlets. And the only thing is that that groups that do so must register with the California Department of Public Health. So California, after the DEA, has came up with this specific legislation and to oversee CBD. And what the one thing we want to make clear to all of you as the Pharmacist Cannabis Coalition of California, PCCC, what has ended up happening is that with these laws, that institutions, facilities, acute care facilities have kind of said, well, listen, things are federally illegal. We're just not going to allow patients to have access to cannabis products in our institution because we're, really going to run afoul of federal law. And of course, we're funded through CMS and so forth. And when we looked at this kind of conundrum between federal and state, what we realized is that we were concerned by not having access to cannabis in these facilities, that there was really a risk to patients. Primarily because, by not having them in these facilities and not having trained individuals, that the patients aren't going to have access. You're not going to be doing medication reconciliation, looking for contraindications with disease states or interactions. You're not going to have consistency between what a patient does at home to what happens when they come to the acute care facility. And what has been reported in the literature by a nursing group is that what would happen was the patient would be utilizing cannabis to control pain at home, be admitted to the hospital, and typically be put on other opioids or other medications to try and solve their pain problems, which oftentimes is not doing the patient any favors either. And then and because it's, not being assessed and known that the patient was using it, there was no way for a clinician to monitor really what, cannabis was doing for the patients and whether positively influencing outcomes or negatively causing adverse effects. So that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about this. Now I'm going to turn it over to Paul to do an analysis of what's happening with Ryan's Law.
Thank you, Carrie, and welcome and good morning. My objective today will be to talk about who is Ryan, what is SB 311, and what did it allow, and what did it not allow. Both Jill and I will have some implications to that. So if we could have the next slide, please. So Ryan Bartell was a 41-year-old Coast Guard person who had pancreatic cancer. And as you know, the prognosis for pancreatic cancer is not great. And he was taking opioids, and he chose to request a cannabis treatment. When he was hospitalized in the state of Washington, he was denied that cannabis treatment. And what he ended up doing was transferring to another hospital in the state of Washington where he could get cannabis instead of opiates. So I think it's an important therapeutic issue to look at is under what circumstances might cannabis be used in place of opiates? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? In Ryan's case, he was successful in that his quality of life improved while he was not on opiates. Next slide, please. So what happened in California was that we had a bill in 2019, SB 305, which was vetoed by the governor due to state and federal law, again, the classification system. However, in this past year, in 2021, Senator Ben Husko of Southern California District introduced SB 311, and that was known as the Compassionate Access to the Medical Cannabis Act. This particular senator had the idea that if hospice patients could be using morphine for quality of life issues, so could they be using medical cannabis. And hence, the governor in September of 2021 signed SB 311, which became functional or implemented January 1st of 2022. So the basic principle is that the patient will have access to cannabis within a healthcare facility, and that they must apply or comply with the Compassionate Use Act of 1996, i.e. there's a medical condition for it, the physician is in agreement with it, and so forth. So let's look at the next slide. So the summary of it is that these patients must be terminally ill, and based on history of hospice, it meant in this case 1 year of life expectancy or less. Second of all, who can obtain marijuana or cannabis? And that would be the requirement of a medical marijuana card known as an MMIC, or written documentation from a prescriber that it was appropriate to use cannabis. Thirdly, it must be stored in a locked container, and that implied that it was under the control of the patient. Now, under California law, for drugs that are not controlled, they must be in a locked drawer near the patient's bedside. It doesn't specifically say where, but it must be in the control of the patient, not the nurse, not the physician, not the pharmacist. It requires documentation in the medical records, and that documentation perhaps might be like have it much dose. It's not the fact that they are using it, and a little bit perhaps of whether they're under the influence, or is it effective or not? Is the patient responding in a effective, efficient, efficacious way, and safety is controlled. Likewise, it is not pertain to emergency departments. So this is really inpatient only and not emergency departments. And the facility is not required to make a recommendation on cannabis. And it must be, of course, in compliance with Prop 213, the Compassionate Use Act. Finally, you may not have an inhaled cannabis product. As you know, smoking has adverse consequences no matter what the substance is, and that includes cannabis. So therefore, those type of products that are inhaled are prohibited from use in an acute care facility. Next one, please. What is not qualified or not specified in SB 311, which we'll have to debate over time today and in the future, is policies and procedures for the healthcare staff. What should they do or what should they not do? Recall that this is in contrast to the Joint Commission standards on how we handle drugs, and usually handled through the pharmacy department. This is not generally proposed in SB 311. Second problem is, how do we know that the patient is eligible? And that would be the possession of a card or a physician's authorization that it is recommended that cannabis be used. Thirdly, how do we document cannabis use in the medical record? And at this point in time, it really is a yes or no kind of question, not so much how much dosage wise, et cetera. And so pharmacists and nurses and others are unfamiliar with this standard, but nevertheless, this is the law. It does not speak to guidelines for pharmacists for record or review of cannabis products. And so how does one determine if it is a cannabis product, and what is it and how much, what is it labeled, what does it really have in it, that kind of thing. And furthermore, then what is the appropriate manner in which to store cannabis? Next, please. In addition, we have statutes involving the DEA, and the DEA, of course, has said it is a Schedule 1. However, the Congress has promoted the use of cannabis laws at the state level. So it's a state's rights versus a federal issue, and the pendulum at the moment is shifted to the states for them to control it. So you'll find some states control it and some do not. California has a reasonable approach to it, and in allowing both medical and recreational use. We're specifically looking at the medical use only. The CMS may also have a role in this because of they controlling the conditions of participation and licensing by the California Department of Public Health and the Joint Commission issues. Their general position has been that they are not involved with the specifics of the therapeutics of whatever drug is used, and therefore have not taken a stand against the use of marijuana. And finally, the Department of Health, California Department of Public Health has the job to enforce SB 311. And that's part of Title 22 in the Code of Regulations, which we're all familiar with, those who practice in acute care as well as long care facilities. Next, please. So I think I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Jill Simonian, who will give you her take on the DEA and a little bit about what the position is of the DEA. Jill?
Okay, thanks. First, before I start with all of these sticky issues of the conflicts between federal and state laws, I definitely want to give a shout out to our colleague, Bob Stein. Hi, Bob. Because Bob was really instrumental in not only helping us develop our policies and procedures, but these slides as well. And we lean on him for our legal counsel. So thanks to him for helping us put this together. So the one thing that I want to point out, there's a few main themes that are woven in between all these next slides I'm going to go over. And number one is Ryan's Law really hinges on the compliance of the Compassionate Use Act of 1996, like has been mentioned already. Secondly, the intent of all of these laws, regulations, enforcement agencies, the real intent is for the safe and effective use of medications and care of our patients. So we really have to remember that that's the goal, is safe and effective use of medications and care of our patients in healthcare facilities. And then thirdly, it's really about compassion for the terminally ill patients. And we have to not forget that. That's what Ryan's Law was designed for. So talking about the DEA, DEA is a federal agency, obviously. I think some healthcare facilities are in fear of violation of the Controlled Substance Act because it's already been explained, cannabis lies within the Schedule I category of the CSA. So mitigating factors with DEA. First of all, within Ryan's Law and our policies and procedures, there will be the pharmacies will not purchase, dispense, or possess any cannabis. So pharmacies will never touch it. Healthcare facility members will never touch it. So that's one way to mitigate that factor. No healthcare facility employee shall control or provide any hands-on action. And, you know, a caveat, not that this is like the ultimate, a factor that makes everybody feel better, but DEA rarely conducts site visits of registrants. Next slide, Carrie. Okay, there's a lot going on this slide, but what I want to emphasize is the California codes and regulations, so the Health and Safety Code, the California healthcare facilities must follow, and how that conflicts with some of the federal agencies. So DEA, we already talked about. DEA's stance is a Schedule I substance, which means that that's illegal. However, California facilities are obligated to abide by California law, which is written in the Health and Safety Code and the California Code of Regulations. So within that is Ryan's Law and the Compassionate Use Act of 1996. So California healthcare facilities are obliged to follow those rules. And again, the health and safety codes are designed for safe and effective care of patients. So that's a really important point. Now, Paul referred to this already, but in 2014, Rohrabacher introduced an amendment, and was passed and signed by the president in 2014 in the Appropriations Act. And that explicitly says that they prohibit the use of federal funds by various states to prevent them from implementing medical cannabis laws. So basically, DEA will not interfere with state medical cannabis laws. They are prohibited from using their funds for that. So despite that this amendment occurs, it doesn't change the fact that cannabis is still a Schedule I in the CSA. And the other problem with it is that this is a bill that has to be, or an amendment that has to be renewed every fiscal year. So far it has been approved and passed by every, signed by every president, but that there is a possibility for that to change depending on our administration and Department of Justice leaders. So clearly the permanent resolution would be to amend the CSA and take cannabis out of Schedule I, but we're not there yet. So next slide, Carrie. Okay, CMS, this is another fear of healthcare facilities. They fear that they're going to lose their CMS funding by allowing medical cannabis in their facility. So mitigating factors for that, CMS actually does not ever directly address the use of medical cannabis. And there has been a public statement from CMS saying that no provider has lost funding or been penalized for permitting medical cannabis. Okay, so this isn't as good as saying, we're never going to do that. It doesn't say that, it just says they haven't so far, but that really does imply that that is not a priority of theirs. Next slide. Okay, so finishing up with CMS, the fear of losing funding from a healthcare facility. There's no provisions in CMS for enforcing cannabis. That's just not really within their jurisdiction. And again, same thread. CMS is about providing safe and effective care of patients. That's the ultimate goal. And that includes terminally ill patients using cannabis. CMS works with state facilities to provide services, but relies on CDPH for the enforcement of the state laws. And the state laws include Ryan's Law and the Compassionate Use Act that healthcare facilities must comply with. And again, just to reiterate, the Rohrabacher Amendment says that federal funds cannot be used to interfere with state medical cannabis laws. Now, that second bullet point, Ryan's Law does provide a safe harbor clause that says that facilities are not required to follow SB 311 if the Department of Justice makes an adverse finding or takes action against the facility. And basically what that's saying is if the facility goes outside of the boundaries of the Compassionate Use Act or violates state laws, then the government might get the Department of Justice might get involved, but that's about it. Okay, next slide. Okay, CDPH, we talked about that a little bit. CDPH is tasked with enforcing compliance of state laws, and that includes the health and safety codes and the California Code of Regulations, now including Ryan's Law, which again, really hinges on the Compassionate Use Act. The main components of Ryan's Law is compliance with the Compassionate Use Act. And that act, again, was an initiative, a ballot initiative passed by the voters in 1996. And pursuant to that ballot, which was Prop 215, it was codified in the Health and Safety Code as the medical marijuana program. It's very detailed, and Ryan's Law refers to that a lot. That is what the healthcare facility has to follow, and CDPH will enforce compliance with that program. Next slide. Title 22 is this is the California Code of Regulations. This is another consideration that I think healthcare facilities have issue with. What about bedside meds? So in particular, the violation of bedside medication policies and procedures. So notwithstanding the fact that within the Business and Professions Code, the FDA, and the Health and Safety Code of California, cannabis is not under the definition of a drug or medication. So if you look at the strict definitions of drug and medication in all of those policies, cannabis is clearly outside of that. So you could say that, you know, we really don't have to follow this because it's not a medication, it's not a drug, but we didn't want to do that in our policies and procedures because we feel like we need to be a little bit more practical and try to conform to Title 22 as best we can, despite the fact that this is a Schedule I drug. So Title 22 states a few requirements. Number one, drugs have to be ordered by a lawfully authorized person in the healthcare facility. Ryan's Law states, the first bullet point, facility will document patient's cannabis use in chart or medical record. So that is in compliance. It does not state that it needs to be documented on the MAR. And, you know, ideally it would be fantastic if it could be a formal medication order, because then we could invoke some drug interaction checking and really monitor this a little bit better. But right now that's not where we are. Maybe some facilities can figure that out. Okay, number two, Title 22 says that bedside medications must be kept in a cabinet drawer and possession by the patient. And Ryan's Law states that cannabis shall be kept in a locked container. And we'll talk about in the policies and procedures when we do our breakout rooms, ways to do this. And this is a little bit flexible. That all Ryan's Law says is it shall be kept in a locked container. Number three, Title 22 states that bedside medications shall not be included, Schedules 2, 3, or 4, allowed at bedside under the patient's control. And it is very clear in Ryan's Law. It's the exact same wording stated in Ryan's Law. No medications in 2, 3, or 4 are allowed by bedside, notwithstanding the fact that cannabis is a Schedule I. And fourth, Title 22 states that contents of bedside medications are examined and identified by pharmacists. I think some healthcare professionals, pharmacists will be uncomfortable doing this because they're not familiar with it. However, we did include in our policies and procedures some very explicit guidelines on how to accomplish this, which we think is really best practice for taking care of our patients. So we'll go over that with you and show you how to characterize the cannabis products. Doesn't mean you have to touch it. Nobody's touching anything, but we can do our best to identify and characterize what the patient is taking. And I think that suits the patient and the healthcare facility best. And again, same thing. The goal for Title 22, it was developed to ensure safe and effective medication use. That's really the common theme. Okay, next. All right, so we've already talked about this. Everybody knows we've drafted some policies and procedures for healthcare facilities to use. This is not a one size fits all. Everybody may have different important parts of it that they want to change or tweak. And, you know, everybody's facility is a little bit different, but we did our best to really detail at least sample guidelines that you can take with you and use them in your facility that will help the patient and comply with some of these federal and state laws. Next. So this is just basically what the policy says, the organization. This is just the first part of it. And this is really the crux of everything. The organization allows the self-administration of patients' own medicinal cannabis at the bedside for terminally ill inpatients pursuant to SB 311, the Compassionate Access to Medical Cannabis Use, in compliance, again, with Prop 215, the Compassionate Use Act of 1996. And that's very well spelled out in the Health and Safety Code. So what we're going to do in our policies and procedures, we're going to show you those next. And we really outlined how to incorporate authorization of the patient, authorization to use, verification of the cannabis product, like I mentioned, and just the entirety of the policies and procedures. So I think Lisa has everybody assigned to a breakout room with one of us
Yes.
folks. So that we're going to show you that Carrie posted the Word document in the chat originally, so you can pull that up, and then we'll go to our breakout rooms and you can just talk in very, very small groups about, you know, just what this looks like and what questions you have or issues with that.
So just a heads up, we don't have Paul.
Yeah, I created 4 rooms, so everyone's in a room. Paul's having internet difficulties.
Okay.
I also sent the policy out via email in case you are having problems downloading in the chat.
Okay, so we have, Lisa, will you just remind us how?
I just opened the rooms. So yeah, so we just need to have people click join. Hi, Sarah. Do you remember which room you were in? You're muted.
Yes, I am in, let me tell you,
Which room?
Jill Simonian.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Looks like we're all slowly popping back in.
Okay, that worked very smoothly, Lisa.
Yay.
Yeah, I was like, okay, I'm gonna speed through this as fast as I can. But we had some really great questions too. So especially about like home use patients who are still under palliative or hospice care. It's a great question.
Good, good, good. We talked about everything except for the policies and procedures. That's
Well,
okay.
There was actually a really great question in the, so I didn't realize this. Everything posted to everybody doesn't show up in the, so I actually went to the side and pulled it up. It didn't show up in my chat.
Oh, really? You mean
Yeah.
the policies and procedures?
Yeah, it did.
Oh.
It does here, but it didn't when I was in the individual room. So I ended up just pulling up.
Oh, got it.
But it's okay. It worked out. It worked out fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, and we actually had a great question while we were talking from, why am I blanking now? But one of our attendees and Mark, and he had asked about suppositories, and I had let him know that the biggest thing about suppositories is how it gets absorbed actually depends on how far into the rectum you actually place the suppository. This is actually new information that I actually just learned from a bunch of colleagues who are utilizing this with their patients. And what they're finding is that 10 centimeters or less, you're not hitting an area of it to cause an issue. So, and it's going to be and it will be systemically absorbed. And if it's higher though, it will actually go through first pass effect.
Yep.
Very interesting.
Yep.
Okay. Looks like we're back.
Man, sorry, Rafi, didn't mean to cut you off, but that was a really good group question. I didn't actually cut you off. The computer did it automatically.
Just pass the buck, Cody. It wasn't you.
No, but Lauren had a really tremendous question, and it was about how does the provider decide whether we should stop cannabis therapy. We were talking then about the physician's scope of practice, and that even if we were proponents of cannabis medicine, we still need to let them practice medicine. Rafi, you were about to share some sage advice. Would you like to unmute yourself and share? You're muted, so no one's heard anything you said since we came to this room.
Okay.
Perhaps we should let Leah start on the before we finish out, because it's already 12:25.
Yeah, we'll do questions later. Yeah, you're right.
Actually, Cody was a great setup because that's exactly what we're going into now is patient safety. So thanks for the setup.
Perfect.
All right, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all over the adverse effects of THC, but I do want to actually mention, though, I would like to add a caveat. It's very similar to when you read every single possible adverse effect from any pharmaceutical medication. There's very often you might not get any of these too. So it's also, for lack of better terms, it's my favorite quote from my toxicologist professor, dose makes the poison. So really, at the end of the day, it really comes to the dose. A lot of these adverse effects are dose related. Some are not. Tachycardia, for example, can be seen at any level, really. But a lot of them really are dose related. You do have some of the more advanced ones, such as cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. This is the cyclical vomiting effect that people can get it's less, I even would say it's a side effect, but even more of like an allergy, almost like where your body is rejecting it. It ends up getting relieved by capsaicin is topical is actually often used, or even hot showers. The heating component actually resolves a lot of those symptoms that you get of the hyperemesis. So again, as I mentioned, there are adverse effects, and this is why it's so important to monitor them, especially for patients who have never used cannabis before. I doubt we would see a lot of the more advanced ones on the right side for patients who are in hospice or palliative care, but it is something we should look out for, especially the cyclical vomiting. And also for any patient who just decides to start using, there is the potential that if they are predisposed to psychotic disorders, there is a chance it could trigger those. So next slide, please. All right, so CBD also has its own adverse effects. The biggest point here is a lot of products actually under-label their CBD products, and a lot actually also over-label, and there is THC in these. So it's very hard to see sometimes, is it the CBD volume? Is it the THC that was added? What is actually causing these effects? We can definitely say that these are the basic adverse effects seen by CBD. Diarrhea is the most common, especially for as you go up with the quantity. It is very effective for both. I say effective, I know it's a side effect, but it is also seen heavily in decreased appetite and weight loss. So for our palliative care and hospice patients, we do want to see if they do actually stop eating, it could be that they're using a higher option of CBD. Might be worth it to discuss with the patient, say, hey, does that product have CBD in it? And if it does, we might want to say, well, that CBD could be preventing you from properly gaining weight. Again, when you're on palliative care and hospice, you hit a point where, are we really looking for that weight gain? But that's the biggest thing for them, is to make sure that we are looking out for those potentials for adverse effects. But again, the dose really does affect to different levels. Next, please. Okay, so interactions with THC for meds. So so for THC, a couple things. The first thing is that it does work on CYP3A4, 2C9, and it also may induce 1A2. As we know, CYP3A4 and 2C9 especially are CYPs that are used for so many medication metabolism, different types of medications. So warfarin you'll see come up both for CBD and THC that both will increase the effects of warfarin, increasing INR. So that is one point that we do want to make sure. If a patient is on a blood thinner, usually if they're on hospice or palliative care, they're not going to be on a blood thinner. But if they are, we will see an increase in this. So we do need to monitor using potentially reducing the warfarin levels. Often we don't really need to adjust the cannabis levels usually as much as we need to reduce the doses or increase the doses of the pharmaceuticals. But this is just to kind of give you a baseline. And then again, as you know, it is CNS depressant. It will increase sedation. So anything with opioids, you can reduce the amount of opioids, analgesics, and CNS depressants, and you should be able to get the same effect because the patient is utilizing THC. So let me just move on again. Next slide, please. Okay. So CBD interactions. So the first thing is fatty foods. This THC as well, you will see an increase in absorption with fatty foods, but especially with CBD, you see an absorption of up to 400%. So that's another thing in these facilities that the food that they're intaking, we make sure it's not very high fatty, because if it is very high fatty, it might actually increase the absorption, or vice versa. If they're used to high fatty before hospice care, and now they're on low fat, it actually might decrease the effect of their medication. So that's important to note. Also, the pharmacodynamics with CBD, we do have a warning with valproic acid, and that with high doses of THC as it increase liver transaminase. So, and the FDA, recommends monitoring for baseline and then at 1 and 2, and this is seen a lot with the epidiolecs. Next, please. Sorry, don't mean to talk so fast. I just know that we're short on time. CBD interactions. So CBD also works on 3A4. It also works on CYP2C19 and 1A2 as well. So the important thing is, again, as we see warfarin again, and then we see the tacrolimus increases the effects. Again, we just want to make sure that because you have two competing, since it's inhibiting these CYP enzymes, the medications used and rely on these medications to break down have the potential of causing an increase. I believe Cody just posted in the chat that we don't really know, because often we see that there might not actually be an interaction between medications, some medications and cannabis, even if they go through the same CYP enzymes. So it's important just to know that, research is still coming out on this, but the ones we've listed are the ones that are more seen to cause these effects. Next, please. Okay, and on to Carrie. Thank you for the closing remarks.
Yeah, sure. Hey, it has been a pleasure to chat with all of you, and thank you all for joining. During today's talk, we've had the opportunity to listen to some of these great experts I get to work with on a day in, day out basis, to understand more about, specifically from a legal perspective, the types of different medical cannabis and really how to differentiate them according to California and federal laws. We've talked specifically about the key features of Ryan's Law, and then ways in which we've tried to mitigate the risk to institutions from legal action, citation, accreditation, by creating drafts of policies and procedures that we think can protect institutions and protect the different clinicians who are going to be interacting with these patients, because that was the reason why nobody allowed it to happen in the first place. And now that we've minimized that risk, I think we're all feeling better that the compassionate use of cannabis can now be fully implemented in California, as I think people had intended it to be back in 1996. So if you have any questions, we are PCCC, the Pharmacist Cannabis Coalition of California. If you have questions for us, we'll have some time here in after the presentation. But you can always contact us at any time at info@pcccrx for pharmacy .org. And you know, we've really enjoyed presenting our findings to you today. So these are some of our references that we have that we've included in the slide set that are available to you. The meeting recording, there's access to this recording is available on Lecture Panda, which is our learning management system here at USC. Lisa, I believe, is going to be sending out those the information as we finish here. If you have any technical or CE questions after the end of this and accessing these information, you can contact Lisa directly, Lisa McDonald at lisamcdo@usc.edu. For CE credit, this has been approved for 1.5 hours, and we're 3 minutes past that 1.5 hours. But we you know, we're within compliance at getting you your CE credit. And we'll give you access to that for those who need it. And if you have questions about the CE component, you know, you have the pharmce@usc.edu email to get information from. So with that, I want to thank you all, and thanks to all the co-presenters, and we'll open it up for questions as a opportunity to you know, clear up anything that's not, you know, as clear as mud at this point.
Somebody's got to have a question. Come on now. Or something they wanted to continue talking about from their breakout room. We'd love to hear some of the most interesting things that you discuss.
That would be Rafi.
Yeah, what was that you were saying, Rafi?
I mean, the question was really around, you know, the provider stopping cannabis, you know, because a lot of providers aren't very well versed on you know, employing cannabis, and they may say stop the cannabis instead of stop the morphine or lorazepam that they've opted for. And you know, I kind of said, hey, look, I agree, it might happen. But, you know, providers are going to practice medicine, and we need to also respect their autonomy as providers. And my hope is that they're having conversations with their patients about what the patient wants as far as what their goals are in therapy.
I was going to bring up the question that Mark asked on the board, which is there a better bioavailability for sublingual as opposed to edible? I like that question. There was actually a really great research that was done on Sativex, which is the 1-to-1 that is currently not allowed and has not been approved for the US. What they did was they did a study and compared it to an oral administration of cannabis. And what they actually showed is that because Sativex has so much liquid that actually gets sprayed into the mucosal layer, they actually showed that most of it gets swallowed. So anything that gets swallowed will go through the first pass effect. So in essence, if you make a product that is very thin, or like if you had a film that actually stuck to the buccal layer or the mucosal or the sublingual layer, you will actually get a better response from it. But once you have a volume of liquid that you're ingesting, even if it starts off as a strip, if you're developing enough saliva due to that strip, you will ingest a lot of it. So really it comes down to how much of the product you're ingesting. The more that gets swallowed, it is going to go first pass effect.
So like if I were to hold a tincture sublingually, it doesn't even matter because people can't reliably hold it.
Well, that plus also depends on what the tincture is made out of. The area underneath our tongue, the blood vessels are so tiny, and you really need to be able to penetrate them. And most of the oils that are used in most formulations are so thick, they're really not going to easily penetrate that layer. So most of it will end up pretty much every time I've ever used a tincture, I'll put it there and I always end up swallowing a chunk of it. So whatever you're swallowing, that's going to go first pass effect. It does not mean that you're not getting the effect from holding it under, but you're still getting a first pass effect from everything you've swallowed.
Because the lion's share of it just cannot get through fast enough. It doesn't matter how long you hold it. You only have you have very thin blood. That makes sense.
And that's also what the data currently suggests, like Carrie suggested. All of the peer-reviewed data that's available says that there actually is very little, if any, enhanced rapid absorption with the sublingual, but rather a more consistent pharmacokinetic profile with less variability around sort of rapid onset of capsules that they saw. But again, there is a lack of overall good data available to assess. There's not standard oils in MCT that have really ever been tested, at least in the data that I just referred to. This is Sativex data. So there is a lot of work to be done to really validate out what sublingual is doing. But what I will say is a lot of practitioners feel very strongly that there is something to it. There are also patients, for example, pediatric patients with epilepsy, whose parents will put oil under their tongue and rapidly see effects. And how and why that happens is, not a pharmacologist's favorite thing to explain, because we like to be able to reduce everything and explain it. And I don't know that we can. So that's my 2 cents as a practitioner.
Wait, you mentioned capsules. Do capsules have a different bioavailability than edibles because they have to break down, or is it just like?
It seems that way. If it's something being co-administered with fat has such a tremendous effect on cannabinoid absorption, that's probably why. But then, like, if you wanted to say capsule versus gummy, hasn't really been hashed out in the way that you would expect.
That was my question. Yeah. Like, how is a Buddy's capsule different from a Buddy's gummy or any other one, right? Like, you guys all know those THC capsules, like, and I feel like those are the most inconsistent form of THC I've ever consumed, where like I'm always like, I don't know.
Well, the other thing too is also what type of capsules being used. And we see this in regular pharmaceutical medications too. It's, there are some that will open easier, that, is it gelatin based? Is it
Right.
cellulose based? And that makes a difference too. It also depends on what's in that capsule. Is it a water soluble product? Is there water? Mostly not. It's usually an oil soluble that's in these capsules. A lot of times gummies are actually made with water soluble extract or alcohol extraction. So that, so there's a lot of components in it as well with what might work and what might not work. So the capsule method will definitely be long, but again, it's not really seen if it's as long as a gummy, just slightly more, just slightly less, but we could definitely say that anything being swallowed will most likely go through the first pass effect, at least from what we've seen so far in research.
Makes sense. Thank you.
To my knowledge, there are no head-to-head comparative PK studies for capsules versus gummies versus any other product. I mean, the only ones we have really are the Sativex studies that show that the PK follows more of the oral route. You can see it by its delayed onset and how it interacts with the fatty foods by increasing absorption.
Yeah, one other interesting thing, and I talk about this when I talk about cannabis law in general, is look at dronabinol. When it first came out in 1986, 87, it was a Schedule II controlled substance. And then after, I think it was about 1998, DEA rescheduled it to Schedule III. It took a couple of years for California to reschedule it to Schedule III, but eventually they did. Interestingly, so now we have dronabinol in sesame oil in a gelatin capsule as Schedule III. However, dronabinol, same exact active ingredient, if in any other medium, is still Schedule II. Now, go try and figure that one out. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. But welcome to government.
Syndros is the brand name of that oral liquid of THC liquid that was made for kids who can't take capsules. So for a while, pharmacies were expected to needle aspirate the sesame oil outside of gelatin capsules. So they decided to make an oral liquid of it.
Do y'all have a
Schedule II.
Oh my God. So as a final question about this whole discussion, like, because what in my job, we help people get like through neurogenomics, get the best thing. And I'm always a little reticent when you're talking about edibles because of the first pass effect, because there's so much variation and just like day to day, like do you guys think the most consistent way if a patient comes to us and say they have anxiety or they want to sleep better? I mean, sleep, I guess, theoretically might be a little different story, but like something where you want to be able to really titrate it effectively. You're not just like, I want to get knocked out, but it's like, no, I want to be a little less anxious and not get the biphasics. because everything I've seen and read about edibles suggests that it's just very difficult, even with all the technology.
For my patients, I usually, it's not, I do edibles, but I consider the tinctures to be edibles because again, they're swallowing it.
Sure.
So I think that for my personal patients, that's all I can speak on. I do usually stick with THC and CBD and other cannabinoid tinctures before I move on to anything else. Once I've gotten my patients stabilized on a dose that we believe is working for them, and they would like a long-acting option as opposed to having to dose as often with the tincture that they found that they had a dose, we might try to switch to an edible. What I found though is that different dispensaries have different things and it's very hard for the patients. So my out-of-state patients, one was in New York, and they run out of product. So even from one chocolate to another, one gummy to another, it's so hit or miss that the best thing to do is find something that works for the patient and stay on it. And not, because it's the hardest thing, because really even one gummy with 5 milligrams of THC, another gummy with 5 milligrams of THC, it might work night or day for a person. You never know.
Right. Thank you.
Testing standards are substandard.
I've read like 20% variation or more, which is crazy. Because on 5 milligrams, I mean, if 5 mgs knocks you out, 20%, even, you know, if you have a high tolerance, 20% is a lot.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. I have to run, but this has been super informative. I appreciate all of y'all, and I'm glad that SoCal is the one that we have this leading this.
We got some
Hey,
Northern
NorCal's
Cal.
here too,
Thanks
Paul.
for joining.
I'm NorCal.
And NorCal's repping
Sorry.
too here.
Listen, I'm from
Great to see you.
SC,
Thanks, Mark.
so fight on, y'all. Sorry.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. I got to run too, but this has been really great. Thanks to all the participants. Thanks to my colleagues whose
Thank you.
expertise in the clinical side is, you know, far beyond my knowledge of the law. But you know, that's why I refer any clinical questions to them. And you know, I can answer the legal questions, but you know, those are the easy ones.
Well, it takes a village, Bob. For real. Thank you, sir. I appreciate
Absolutely.
all your work on this.
All right, take care, everybody. See ya.
Thank you.